Marcus Sterling adjusted his tie for the third time as he stared at the blueprints spread across his mahogany desk. The sleek glass tower he designed for downtown Chicago stretched 47 stories into the sky on paper, each line precise and calculated. He should have felt pride looking at it, his latest triumph, another gleaming monument to his architectural prowess. Instead, all he could think about was the phone call from his sister 2 hours ago. "Marcus, you need to be here Friday instead of Saturday this year," Chloe had said, her voice carrying that familiar note of determination that had gotten them both into trouble as children. "I need help with preparations for the reunion." He tried to protest, explaining his packed schedule, the client meetings, the deadlines that seemed to multiply like weeds in his carefully manicured professional garden. But Chloe had been insistent, and something in her tone, a barely contained excitement that she was obviously trying to suppress, had made him reluctantly agree. Now, as the afternoon light filtered through his office windows, casting long shadows across the architectural plans, Marcus found himself thinking about the lighthouse. It always came back to the lighthouse, that crumbling monument to his father's unfulfilled dreams that stood sentinel on the cliff overlooking their hometown's rocky shore. David Sterling had spent countless evenings at their kitchen table, sketching restoration plans, calculating costs, dreaming of the day he'd bring the old beacon back to life. He died of a heart attack at 58, those dreams still trapped in manila folders that now gathered dust in their mother's attic. Marcus had been 25 then, fresh out of graduate school with a head full of ambition and a portfolio of modern designs that had nothing to do with weathered stone and maritime history. He'd promised himself he'd get to the lighthouse someday, once he'd established himself, once he'd proven his worth in the world of steel and glass. 15 years later, someday had become a weight he carried everywhere, a constant reminder of promises unkept and legacies unfulfilled. His assistant knocked and entered without waiting for permission, a habit that usually annoyed him but today felt oddly comforting. "Your car is here, Mr. Sterling. The drive to Cedar Point is about 3 hours, right?" 3.5, Marcus corrected, already reaching for his jacket. The small coastal town where he'd grown up felt like it existed in a different universe from his Chicago high-rise, a place where time moved differently and memories had more weight than blueprints. The drive gave him too much time to think, to remember. He'd made this journey dozens of times over the years, but lately, each trip felt more like a pilgrimage to a shrine of his own inadequacy. The lighthouse stood there, watching over the town like a broken promise, its walls crumbling a little more each winter, its light forever extinguished. Cedar Point appeared around the final bend just as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The town looked exactly as it had in his childhood, weathered fishing boats bobbing in the harbor, Victorian houses with their gingerbread trim painted in cheerful pastels, the old lighthouse standing guard on its rocky perch. Marcus had always found the unchanging nature of the place both comforting and suffocating. The Sterling family home sat on Maple Street, a modest 2-story colonial that had housed 4 generations of his family. His mother, Helen, had maintained it with the same meticulous care she'd shown when raising Marcus and Chloe after their father's death. The garden still bloomed with the same flowers his father had planted, and the front porch still creaked in all the familiar places. Chloe's car was already in the driveway, a battered Subaru that looked like it had seen better decades. She'd driven up from Portland, where she worked as a marine biologist, studying tidal patterns and ocean conservation. Her life had always seemed more connected to their father's love of the sea, while Marcus had fled inland to build monuments to human ambition. "Marcus." Chloe burst through the front door before he'd even turned off the engine, her auburn hair catching the last rays of sunlight. At 36, she still moved with the energetic grace that had made her the star of their high school soccer team. "You made good time. Come on, I've got a million things for you to help with." He barely had time to grab his overnight bag before she was pulling him toward the house, chattering about seating arrangements and menu planning with an enthusiasm that seemed forced. Something was off about her demeanor, a barely contained excitement that made her words tumble over each other. "Where's Mom?" he asked as they entered the familiar warmth of the living room, with its overstuffed furniture and walls covered in family photos. She's at the grocery store with Aunt Margaret. They'll be back soon. Chloe was already moving toward the kitchen, her movements quick and purposeful. I need you to help me move some furniture around. The dining room table needs to be repositioned, and there are some boxes in the garage that need to be brought up to the attic. Marcus followed her, noting the way she avoided his eyes, the slight tremor in her hands as she gestured toward various tasks. In all their years of family reunions, Chloe had never been the one to organize seating charts or worry about table placement. She was more likely to suggest everyone eat on the beach with paper plates. "Since when do you care about furniture arrangements?" he asked, settling into one of the kitchen chairs where he'd eaten countless childhood meals. "Since I grew up and realized these things matter," she replied, but her laugh was too bright, too quick. "Come on, Marcus. Don't be difficult. I really need your help." The next few hours passed in a blur of seemingly pointless tasks. Chloe had him rearranging furniture that looked perfectly fine where it was, moving boxes that appeared to contain nothing but old Christmas decorations, and helping her organize the garage in a way that seemed designed to keep him busy rather than accomplish anything meaningful. Every time he tried to engage her in real conversation, asking about her work, her life in Portland, why she'd seemed so distant in their recent phone calls, she deflected with another task or a change of subject. It was maddening, this dance around genuine connection that had characterized their relationship for months. "Chloe, what's really going on?" he finally asked as they stood in the garage, surrounded by boxes that had been moved from one side to the other and back again. "You're acting strange, and this whole help with preparations thing feels like busy work." She turned to face him, and for a moment, he saw something flicker in her eyes, a mixture of excitement and apprehension that reminded him of the Christmas mornings when she'd been too eager to wait for their parents to wake up before attacking the presents under the tree. "I just want everything to be perfect," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "You know how important these reunions are to Mom." Before Marcus could press further, the sound of car doors slamming announced the arrival of their mother and aunt. The moment was lost as they were swept into the familiar chaos of family greetings and dinner preparations. Helen Sterling, at 72, still moved with the efficiency of someone who had raised 2 children while working full-time as a high school English teacher. Her silver hair was pulled back in the same practical bun she'd worn for decades, and her eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made Marcus's teenage years both challenging and rewarding. "Marcus, sweetheart," she said, enveloping him in a hug that smelled of lavender and familiar comfort. "You look tired. Are you eating enough?" "I'm fine, Mom," he replied, the same answer he'd given to the same question for 15 years. "Just busy with work." Aunt Margaret, Helen's younger sister, had driven up from Boston for the reunion. She'd never married, dedicating her life to teaching elementary school and spoiling her niece and nephew with the enthusiasm of someone who treated every visit like a holiday. Her gray hair was cut in a stylish bob, and her blue eyes sparkled with the same mischievous intelligence that Marcus remembered from his childhood. "Marcus, dear, you simply must tell me about this latest project of yours," she said, settling into the kitchen chair beside him. "Chloe mentioned something about a skyscraper?" As Marcus found himself explaining the Chicago Tower project, he noticed Uncle Ben's arrival. Ben Morrison had been his father's closest friend, a retired history professor who had spent decades researching the maritime heritage of the Maine coast. He was a tall, lean man in his 70s, with a shock of white hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors studying shipwrecks and lighthouse construction. "Marcus," Ben said, his voice carrying the warm authority that had made him a beloved teacher at the local college. "It's good to see you, son." There was something in Ben's greeting, a weight of unspoken meaning that Marcus couldn't quite interpret. The older man's eyes held a knowing look that made Marcus feel like he was missing something important. Dinner was a comfortable affair, filled with the familiar rhythms of family conversation. Marcus found himself relaxing for the first time in months, letting the warmth of home cooking and easy laughter wash over him. But he couldn't shake the feeling that there were undercurrents he wasn't understanding, glances exchanged between Chloe and Ben that stopped abruptly whenever he looked in their direction. After dinner, as they sat on the front porch watching the stars emerge over the harbor, Ben settled into the wicker chair beside Marcus, with a glass of his father's favorite whiskey. "Your father would have been proud of what you've accomplished," Ben said quietly, his voice carrying over the sound of waves against the distant shore. "He always said you had the eye for it, the ability to see what a space could become." Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever anyone mentioned his father's dreams. "He had his own vision for this place," he replied, nodding toward the lighthouse that stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky. "I never got around to making it real." He understood that everyone has their own path, Ben continued. But he also believed that some dreams have a way of finding their own time, their own way of becoming real. There was something in Ben's tone, a certainty that seemed to carry more weight than mere consolation. Marcus turned to study the older man's profile, but Ben was looking out at the lighthouse, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I should probably check on that old place tomorrow," Marcus said, more to himself than to Ben. "Make sure it's still structurally sound." "Oh, I wouldn't worry about that," Ben replied quickly. "I've been keeping an eye on it. The structure is more solid than it looks." Later that evening, as Marcus lay in his childhood bedroom listening to the familiar sounds of the old house settling around him, he found himself thinking about Ben's words. There had been something almost conspiratorial in the older man's tone, as if he knew something Marcus didn't. The next morning brought the controlled chaos of reunion day. Relatives began arriving early, filling the house with the sounds of laughter and conversation. Marcus threw himself into the role of helpful host, carrying luggage, setting up additional seating, and trying to ignore the way Chloe seemed to be orchestrating everyone's movements like a conductor leading an invisible orchestra. His cousin Robert arrived with his wife and 3 young children, followed by various aunts, uncles, and family friends who had been part of these annual gatherings for as long as Marcus could remember. The house filled with the sounds of children playing, adults catching up on a year's worth of news, and the familiar rhythm of a large family reunion. But throughout the morning, Marcus noticed the same pattern of hushed conversations and meaningful glances that had characterized the previous evening. Chloe moved through the crowd with barely contained excitement, her cheeks flushed with something that went beyond the simple pleasure of family gathering. "Marcus, could you help me with something in the kitchen?" she asked during a brief lull in the conversation. He followed her, expecting another pointless task, but instead found her standing by the window that overlooked the harbor, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I need to tell you something," she began, then stopped, shaking her head. "No, that's not right. I need to show you something." "Chloe, what is going on?" Marcus asked, his frustration finally boiling over. "You've been acting strange for months. You barely return my calls, and when you do, you seem distracted. Now you're practically vibrating with some kind of secret. Just tell me what's wrong." She turned to face him, and he saw tears in her eyes. Not sad tears, but the kind that came from overwhelming emotion held too long in check. "Nothing's wrong," she said softly. "Everything is actually more right than it's been in a very long time. But I can't tell you. I have to show you." Before Marcus could respond, she was moving toward the dining room, where their mother was standing near the table laden with the traditional reunion feast. "Everyone," Helen called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention from rooms full of teenagers. "Chloe has something special planned for dessert, but she says we need to take a walk first." Marcus watched as his sister stood in the center of the room, her face glowing with an excitement that made her look years younger. "I hope everyone wore comfortable shoes," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "We're going to take a short walk before dessert." The assembled family, nearly 20 people ranging in age from Marcus's 5-year-old great-nephew to Ben's 80-year-old brother, began gathering coats and following Chloe toward the front door. Marcus found himself swept along with the crowd, his confusion growing with each step. "Where are we going?" he asked, but Chloe had already moved to the front of the group, leading them down Maple Street toward the harbor. The procession had an almost ceremonial quality, family members walking in small groups, their conversation subdued, as if they were approaching something sacred. Marcus noticed that several of the adults seemed to know where they were headed, their faces showing the same barely contained excitement that had characterized Chloe's behavior. They walked through the town center, past the old general store, and the harbor where fishing boats bobbed at their moorings. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the water, and a gentle breeze carried the salt smell of the sea. Marcus had walked this route countless times during his childhood, but today it felt different, charged with anticipation. As they reached the base of the cliff path that led to the lighthouse, Marcus felt his chest tighten. The lighthouse had stood there for over a century, its white stone walls weathered by countless storms, its light extinguished for the past 20 years due to the prohibitive cost of repairs. It was a monument to neglect, a constant reminder of his father's unfulfilled dreams. "Chloe," he said, catching up to his sister at the front of the group. "I don't think this is a good idea. The path is overgrown, and some of the older family members." "The path is fine," she interrupted, her voice carrying a confidence that surprised him. "I've been checking on it regularly." As they began the gentle climb up the cliff face, Marcus noticed that the path was indeed clear. More than clear, it looked like it had been recently maintained. The usual tangle of beach grass and wild roses had been cut back, and the wooden steps that his father had built decades ago looked newly repaired. "When did you have time to clear this?" he asked, but Chloe was already moving ahead, leading the family up the winding path with sure steps. The climb took about 15 minutes, the conversation growing quieter as they ascended. Marcus found himself walking beside Ben, who moved with the steady pace of someone who had made this journey many times before. "Beautiful evening for a walk," Ben observed, his tone carefully neutral. "I still don't understand why we're—" Marcus began, then stopped as they rounded the final bend in the path. The lighthouse stood before them, but it was not the lighthouse of his memories. The crumbling walls had been restored to pristine white stone, their mortar joints perfectly pointed, their surface gleaming in the late afternoon sun. The windows, which had been boarded up for years, now sparkled with new glass. The door, which had hung askew on rusted hinges, stood straight and proud, painted in the deep blue that matched the color of the ocean below. But it was the light that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. The lantern room, which had been dark for 2 decades, was lit. The powerful beams swept across the harbor in a steady, rhythmic pattern, just as it had during his childhood, when his father would bring him here to watch the ships navigate safely to shore. And across the base of the lighthouse, unfurled like a banner of dreams made manifest, hung a sign that read, "The David Sterling Memorial Lighthouse, restored with love, 2025. Marcus stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. This was impossible. The lighthouse had been derelict, beyond repair, too expensive to restore. He'd looked into it himself several times over the years, getting estimates from contractors that ran into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. "Surprise," Chloe said softly, appearing at his elbow. Her voice was thick with emotion, tears streaming down her cheeks. "We did it, Marcus. We actually did it." The family had gathered around them in a semicircle, their faces glowing with the kind of joy that came from being part of something larger than themselves. Marcus turned in a slow circle, seeing the same expression of pride and love on every face, his mother, his aunt, his cousins, Ben, even the children who might not have fully understood what they were witnessing, but could sense its importance. "I don't understand," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "How is this possible?" Chloe wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, her smile radiant. "It took us almost a year. After Dad's birthday last year, I couldn't stop thinking about the lighthouse. I knew you felt guilty about not restoring it, but I also knew you'd never let us help if we asked. You'd insist on doing it yourself or finding some way to pay for it alone." She gestured toward the gleaming structure, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "So I talked to Ben, and he helped me contact some of Dad's old friends who had been involved in historic preservation. We formed a committee, applied for grants, organized fundraisers. The whole town got involved." Ben stepped forward, his weathered face creased with pride. "Your father's original plans were still in his files," he said. "We used them as the basis for the restoration. Every detail is exactly as he envisioned it." Marcus felt as if the ground beneath his feet had shifted. The weight he'd carried for 15 years, the guilt, the sense of failure, the constant reminder of promises unkept, suddenly lifted, replaced by something so overwhelming he couldn't name it. "The light," he managed to say. "It's actually functioning?" "Fully restored," Chloe replied. "The Coast Guard approved it last month. It's once again an active navigational aid, just like Dad always wanted." Marcus walked slowly toward the lighthouse, his family following at a respectful distance. He ran his hands along the perfect white stone, feeling the solid reality of dreams made manifest. The door opened at his touch, revealing an interior that had been completely restored. The spiral staircase gleamed with fresh paint, and the walls displayed a series of photographs documenting the restoration process. There were pictures of Chloe directing volunteers, of Ben consulting with stonemasons, of his mother organizing bake sales to raise funds. There were images of the lighthouse in various stages of repair, from the initial clearing of debris to the installation of the new lighting system. It was a year's worth of love and labor, documented in careful detail. "You did this," Marcus said, turning to face his sister. "You actually did this." "We all did it," Chloe corrected. "Every person here contributed something. Mom organized the fundraising. Ben provided the historical expertise. The cousins helped with the physical labor. Even little Sarah drew pictures that we sold at the craft fair." Marcus looked at his 5-year-old great-niece, who beamed with pride at being included in the explanation. The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking, an entire family and community united in secret to fulfill a dream that had seemed impossible. "But why?" he asked. "Why go to all this trouble?" Chloe stepped closer, her hand finding his arm. "Because Dad's dream mattered. Because you mattered. Because carrying that guilt was eating you alive, and we couldn't stand to watch it anymore." The words hit him like a physical blow. He'd thought he'd hidden his feelings, maintained his professional composure, kept his personal struggles separate from his family relationships. But they'd seen through his careful facade, recognized the weight he'd been carrying. "I want to tell you so many times," Chloe continued. "That's why I seemed distant. I was dying to share what we were doing, but I knew you'd try to stop us or take over the project. I wanted you to have this moment, to see the finished dream without having to worry about the process." Marcus felt tears streaming down his face, years of suppressed emotion finally finding release. The lighthouse stood before him, solid and real, its light sweeping across the harbor in the same pattern he remembered from childhood. But more than that, it stood as a testament to the power of family, to the possibility of dreams deferred but not abandoned. "I can't believe you did this," he whispered. "Believe it," Ben said, joining them at the base of the lighthouse. "Your father would be proud, not just of the lighthouse, but of the family that made it possible." The celebration that followed was unlike any family reunion Marcus had ever experienced. They gathered around the lighthouse as the sun set, sharing stories about David Sterling and his love for the sea. The children ran in circles around the base of the tower, their laughter echoing across the water. The adults stood in small groups, their faces illuminated by the lighthouse beam as it swept overhead. Marcus found himself in conversation after conversation, learning details about the restoration that amazed him. The project had involved dozens of skilled craftspeople, from stonemasons who had repaired the damaged walls to electricians who had installed the modern lighting system. The town had rallied around the effort, with local businesses donating materials and services. "The hardware store gave us all the paint," his cousin Robert explained. "The glass company replaced the windows at cost. Even a Coast Guard helped with the approval process." It was a testament to the impact his father had made on the community during his lifetime. David Sterling had been a man who helped his neighbors, who contributed to local charities, who believed in the importance of preserving history for future generations. The lighthouse restoration had become a way for the entire town to honor his memory. As the evening wore on, Marcus found himself climbing the spiral staircase to the lantern room. The view from the top was breathtaking, the harbor spread out below, the town lights twinkling like stars, the ocean stretching to the horizon. He could see why his father had loved this place, why he dreamed of bringing it back to life. Chloe joined him at the top, the two of them standing in comfortable silence as the lighthouse beams swept across the water. Below them, their family continued to celebrate, their voices carrying on the evening breeze. "Thank you," Marcus said finally. "I don't think I have words for what this means." "You don't need words," Chloe replied. "I could see it in your face. That moment when you realized what we'd done, it was everything I'd hoped for." Marcus turned to study his sister's profile, seeing her as if for the first time. She'd orchestrated this entire effort, managing dozens of people and countless details, all while maintaining the pretense of distance to protect the surprise. The skill and dedication required was staggering. "I've been a terrible brother," he said. "I was so wrapped up in my own guilt and ambition that I never saw how capable you were, how much you were willing to do for this family." "You haven't been terrible," Chloe said firmly. "You've been carrying a burden that wasn't yours to carry alone. Dad's dream was about bringing people together, about creating something that would serve the community. Making it a solo project would have missed the point entirely." They stood together as the lighthouse beam continued its steady sweep, a rhythm that would continue through the night and all the nights to come. The light that had been extinguished for 20 years was once again guiding ships safely to harbor, fulfilling the purpose for which it had been built. As they descended the stairs to rejoin their family, Marcus felt a profound shift in his understanding of success and legacy. The towers he'd built in Chicago were impressive monuments to human ambition, but this lighthouse was something more, a symbol of community, of shared dreams, of the power of love to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. The family gradually made their way back down the cliff path, their voices subdued by the magnitude of what they'd experienced. Marcus walked beside his mother, who had been unusually quiet during the celebration. "Mom," he said, "did you really organize bake sales to fund this?" Helen Sterling smiled, her face showing the same mischievous pride he'd seen in Chloe's expression. "I haven't had that much fun in years," she admitted. "It felt good to have a project that mattered, something that would honor your father's memory." "I wish I'd been part of it," Marcus said. "You were part of it," she replied. "You were the reason we did it. Every brick we repaired, every dollar we raised, every hour we worked, it was all because we love you and wanted to give you peace." Back at the house, the reunion continued with a different energy. The successful completion of the lighthouse restoration had given everyone a sense of shared accomplishment that went beyond the usual family gathering. Children who had been running around the lighthouse were now drawing pictures of it with crayons borrowed from their grandmother's craft supplies. Adults were sharing stories about the restoration process, comparing notes on the various challenges they'd overcome. Marcus found himself in the center of it all, no longer the distant relative who visited out of obligation, but the grateful recipient of an extraordinary gift. He moved from group to group, listening to stories about the year-long effort, learning about the coordination required to keep such a large secret. "The hardest part was last month," his cousin Sarah explained. "We were doing the final electrical work, and you called Chloe while we were all up there. She had to pretend she was in Portland while she was actually standing in the lantern room." "I nearly gave it away 3 times, admitted Uncle Ben. "Whenever you mentioned the lighthouse, I wanted to tell you what we were doing. But Chloe threatened to ban me from the project if I spoiled the surprise." As the evening wound down and relatives began to head home, Marcus found himself helping with the cleanup alongside Chloe. The house felt different now, not just the setting for a family obligation, but the headquarters of a successful conspiracy of love. "What happens now?" he asked as they washed dishes in the familiar kitchen. "Now the lighthouse is part of the town's maritime museum," Chloe explained. "Ben is going to lead tours during the summer months. The Coast Guard will maintain the light itself, but we've established a trust fund for ongoing maintenance of the building." "And you're moving back to Cedar Point?" Chloe paused in her drying of a serving platter, considering the question. "I'm thinking about it. The marine biology program at the college has offered me a position, and I'd like to be closer to family. This project showed me how much I'd been missing by living so far away." Marcus nodded, understanding the feeling. The lighthouse restoration had revealed the depth of connection that existed within their family, relationships that had been maintained despite distance and busy schedules. It had shown him what was possible when people united around a shared purpose. "I'm going to spend more time here too," he said. "I've been thinking about opening a small office in town, maybe taking on some local projects." historic preservation, sustainable development, things that matter to the community. Dad would love that, Chloe said softly. Later that night, Marcus walked out onto the front porch one final time before heading to bed. The lighthouse beam was visible from the house, its steady sweep a comforting presence in the darkness. He thought about his father, who had spent so many evenings on this same porch, dreaming of the day when the lighthouse would shine again. The dreams had taken longer to fulfill than David Sterling had hoped, but they had been fulfilled in a way that exceeded his original vision. The lighthouse wasn't just restored, it was the centerpiece of a community effort that had brought together dozens of people in a common cause. It represented not just one man's dream, but the collective will of a family and a town to preserve something beautiful and meaningful. Marcus pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found his assistant's number. He composed a brief message. "Cancel my meetings for Monday. I'm staying in Maine for a few extra days. We'll call with new schedule soon." For the first time in his professional life, he felt no anxiety about changing his plans, no guilt about putting personal relationships before business obligations. The lighthouse stood as proof that some things were more important than deadlines and client meetings, that the most meaningful achievements often required patience, collaboration, and love. As he prepared for bed in his childhood room, Marcus reflected on the transformation that had occurred in a single day. He'd arrived in Cedar Point carrying the weight of 15 years of guilt and unfulfilled promises. He was leaving with a profound sense of peace and gratitude, his relationship with his family healed and strengthened by their extraordinary gift. The lighthouse beam swept across his window one final time as he drifted off to sleep, its light a symbol of dreams fulfilled and new possibilities on the horizon. In the morning, he would climb the cliff path again, this time not as a guilty son avoiding his father's legacy, but as a proud family member ready to help preserve and celebrate it. The light that had been extinguished for 20 years was shining again, guiding ships safely to harbor and families safely home. And in its steady, rhythmic sweep, Marcus Sterling had found his own way back to the things that mattered most.